So this was a really interesting chapter, and not in the way that I think most people would figure if you're only looking at the surface area, right? And I think that's mainly because of everything that we just saw happen in the last couple chapters, but I'd say this one is just loaded with so many potential directions for the story that you might miss it if you're only worried about the big key players in the manga currently. Because obviously there's the Famine Devil, there's Fake Sawman, who we know little to nothing about other than the fact that he or she is responsible for killing Yuko. Then there's whatever Yoshida's been on, so I wouldn't disagree with you if you feel there's a lot more urgent matters for the manga to be worried about. It's almost like this romance between Denji and Asa shouldn't be the priority at the moment, but this chapter really knuckles down on what was my biggest suspicion of the manga, because it's no surprise that Fujimoto's been consistently alluding and referencing back to the earlier arcs of part 1, right? And this is a pattern that you might have noticed ever since the Bat Devil returned in chapter 101, but I'd say this chapter is the one to really set the pattern going forward. And this is where it gets really interesting for me, because if you look back to when we saw the Eternity Devil arc in part 1 and the return of the Eternity Devil in part 2, we're almost seeing a major similarity here, which is Denji's experience with a woman. And of course there's also major differences as well, right? But for anyone who needs to be reminded, it was only after the Eternity Devil arc in part 1 where we saw Denji and Himeno almost hook up, and then after the whole Katana Man fight we see him and Makima go on their first date in chapter 39, so we get two prime examples of Denji gathering experience with two different women. And if you compare this to where we are in part 2, it's like you almost have to wonder if we're gonna see a repeat of the whole Denji and Himeno situation, especially considering that they're having this second date over at Denji's place. This is similar to the first experience he had over at Himeno's apartment. Now thankfully Asa is around his age, right? So I imagine that would make this a lot more comfortable for him, but this is really as far as that comparison goes, right? So I am not trying to say that Denji and Asa are bound to do anything sensual or anything like that, but this also reminds me a lot of Denji's first date with Makima, and I'm sure you can understand why if you go back to chapter 39. So it's interesting how Fujimoto is almost redesigning the structure of part 1 here in part 2. It's just with a whole new story, and this is why I'm almost positive there's gonna be a third date after we get into the return of the Katana Man arc in part 2. And let me just say it right now that I have no idea if Katana Man will return in part 2, right? However, I don't think it necessarily needs to be Katana himself to fulfill that pattern of Fujimoto rehashing the arcs that we saw in part 1, because maybe this is where we see Fake Sawman step in, right? Maybe instead of Katana versus Chainsaw, we see Fake Saw versus Chainsaw, since it seems like a large part of part 2 is about Denji's struggle with his identity. And I'm so sorry guys, I'm really trying my best to hard focus on this week's chapter, but that's what makes it so good. It's like it completely turned the structure of part 1 upside down on its head, and it's been doing this for a couple chapters now. But again, I have no idea if we'll see the legitimate return of Katana. I have no idea if there's gonna be a third date with Asa and Denji. This is all just pure speculation on my part, but to be fair, this is my inference based on what we've already read happen in the story. So if we're using history as a reference point, then I think it only makes sense that we see Chainsaw Man versus some kind of villain who resembles Denji in the same way we saw Katana fulfill that role in part 1. So if Chainsaw Man versus Fake Sawman is the next big arc, then I think that would actually be kind of genius by Fujimoto, because it would only further push the big question that Asa and Yoru have been asking, which is who is actually Chainsaw Man? And in a sense, we've already seen Denji have to wrestle with his own values and self-respect in part 2 already. Like in chapter 117, where we see him talking to himself and he says, "What am I doing? I made up my mind to quit it with the mindless obedience." So obviously Denji's come a long way to where he realizes his mistakes, but he still does them regardless, right? And I can honestly make a whole video on Denji wrestling with himself based on part 2 alone, because there are several examples where we see Denji force himself into some sort of compromise between his old self and who he is in part 2. So I can really only imagine what kind of psychological damage a fight between him and Fake Sawman would do to him, and that compromise between the Denji from part 1 and the Denji that he's trying to become in part 2 is really important, because if you go back towards the end of the Katana Man arc in part 1, there's a moment when Katana tries to get inside Denji's head in chapter 36. He says, "You're the only one who doesn't have a human heart anymore." And ironically, it's also on his date with Makima in chapter 39 where he thinks back on this and asks her himself. He says, "Miss Makima, do you think I have a heart?" So it feels like we've only been seeing minor instances of Denji trying to resolve himself into changing for the better, but again, that's what makes this his internal conflict. I would even go further and say that this will ultimately get in the way of Denji and Asa's relationship, and that's what made their first date so important, right? Because not only did they never even talk about Chainsaw Man to each other, but not even Yoru was there, so that's a major reason why they both wanted this second date, because there was some kind of spark that happened that probably would not have happened otherwise if Yoru was there or if Denji had to fight his way out of the aquarium. And I'm sorry if it feels like I haven't touched on this week's chapter, I just became so much more invested on what happens after, but I think the next few chapters are gonna be pretty subtle, right? I mean, it's obvious we're gonna see some interaction between Yoru and Nayuta, so I'm really interested in how that goes, since Denji had mentioned earlier Nayuta's smart enough to start college, so we know it'll most likely be a confrontation between the War Devil and the Control Devil than anything else, since I highly doubt Nayuta is some airheaded little girl. Now, in the worst case scenario, we'll probably see Yoru take control over Asa to understand why she couldn't turn Denji into a weapon, but even then, I think Yoru won't be too much of an issue, since she technically also has feelings for Denji too now, right? It would actually be kind of funny to see Denji go on a date with Yoru instead of Asa this time. There's just so many ways this can go that I'm not really sure what to expect here, but it looks like we won't be getting the next chapter until about 2 weeks from now, so we'll just have to wait and see. But this is where I'm gonna end the video with, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you're new to the channel, then make sure you subscribe. I cover the Chainsaw Man manga here on the channel, so make sure to subscribe to stay updated. But before I end the video, I just want to give a very special thanks to the channel's patrons: Iron, Justin, Nix EXP, Paranormal Beluga, Jedi Knight 104, Pedyuko, Malekith, and Wyatt Calco. Thank you so much for the support, guys. You guys are the best, and like always, if you're interested, you can sign up too and get into the monthly Q&A that I do here on the channel. I'll be posting the next one up sometime at the start of February, so from now until the end of January, feel free to consider joining. You would also be helping me out a lot here in a massive way and get a special shout out like this in every single video. The link will be in the description below, or you could just search it yourself at patreon.com/Izanami. But other than that, guys, again, thank you so much for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, I would greatly appreciate it, and feel free to comment down below what your thoughts are on this week's chapter, anything you agreed or disagreed with, and yeah, have a great day.